Hello and welcome back. I just said, oh, that lighting is a bit poor today. Um, just wanted to sneak in a quick streaming session today. I had kind of planned out some refactorings a few weeks ago and didn't quite get around to all of them. So I said I'd um, try and sneak a relatively, well, as usual, I hope it'll be a quick one in. It's to do with something I was trying out before, which was, I suppose, using or looking at potential macro expansion and kind of removing a common pattern, which is evaluating a an AST kind of pre-evaluated expression to specifically the likes of an integer or a string or things like that. Um, so what I'll do is I'll open up the main module that I'll be working on, and I made a backup of some code from before that I'll be looking at using here. So the code involved is a macro, which I was kind of experimenting with a similar idea on the stream before, but um, in between streams I kind of got it into a better shape, kind of more along the lines of what I was looking for. And I'll be looking at kind of slotting it into the existing work today. So just to take a look at what kind of expression I want to be refactoring with this kind of work. So this kind of so if I take a look at a number of existing expressions, particularly for lines that match this pattern of match lock. So in a number of these areas, what is generally the case, or what can be observed, is this pattern of it. Usually when I'm working with an AST node, especially an AST expression, oftentimes what I'll want is I'll want the value of a particular expression, and to perform that evaluate, to get the actual value, the evaluated value of the pre-evaluated expression, I usually have to call this function called eval expression. I have to do a check to see did an error occur, and abort if one did. And then if I do get a value out of it, then what I'll generally do, it's very common for the very next expression to be a match on the locked value that gets returned. And this is quite quite a common thing. So if we look at, just through here, there's probably, half a dozen at least, if not a dozen, examples of this kind of repeated code. And it's not that, on its own, it's not, I wouldn't call it too onerous, but just because it's repeated so often throughout the code, I'd only be saving the likes of one or two lines, but even that simplification, just because it's repeated so often, I think simplifying that with anything really would would clean things up and make things hopefully a little more readable, and can be used for another refactoring that I'll go into in a minute. So the refactoring that I had been looking at is to define a new macro called match eval expression, and what it does essentially is collapse. So if I look for one of these examples again, what it does is would essentially collapse the likes of this kind of an expression into, all the almost like a single expression, more or less collapses this line and this line into a somewhat simpler expression. So if I went let b, for example, then I could do match eval expression. In this case, something I learned in the previous stream, thanks to some of the viewers, was that while I think every single instance of eval expression does copy in or does use local variables named, scopes, and built-in, because the namespace within the macro can't access the namespace or scope outside of the macro, those still have to be passed in kind of as is. So I'd have to go scopes, built-ins, and in this case, I'd be passing in, let me just check a sample invocation of that. Yeah, so I would be going something like cond here. And I've broken the pattern within the macro up in this way. In fact, I forgot the bang here, but I've broken the macro up in this way, so it looks, I suppose, it almost looks like a somewhat custom, built-in kind of branch statement almost, rather than, I suppose my initial thought was something like, it'd look more like a parameters to a function, for example. But so there's this encapsulated set of what could be considered parameters almost, and then the regular body of a match down here. What I had originally in this macro as well was the fourth expression. There was going to be a fourth expression here, and it would contain the string. For example, if I had this string, I was going to put it in here, and it would save having to add that line. But just looking at it from a couple of different examples, I think it actually, it's not simplifying much, and I think it's just clearer to have that on its own line. So I'll probably remove that part from the rule and just simplify things a little, which will allow me to get rid of the message part as well. And that's basically the first bit of this refactoring. So it would basically remove one line from each of these, and I would say somewhat simplifies things. And that's more or less it, really. We can see up here as well exactly what gets abstracted by this. So it removes the eval expression call. It removes this checking of the value. It also, if I decided to have extra kind of, not necessarily safety, but extra processing around here when an evaluation does fail, then that'll give me a common point to apply it throughout. And yeah, one of the big things it removes as well is this kind of hairiness, and might also give an opportunity to give this a slightly better name, because one of the reasons that it has such a short name is because it's used so often almost. That's not necessarily an excuse for giving it a bad name, but it is kind of one of the one of the reasons behind that. So if I take a look at this, for example, and just try to compile what I have here, hopefully. So when calling this no rules expected, this macro, yes, so this is probably, so there are a couple of limitations to what I have so far, because again, I'm not the most familiar with macros. So that returns a mutable reference to a Boolean instead. But before I go into that anyway, the macro rules as I have them so far anyway is I take two identifiers here, so the scopes and built-in variables, variable names anyway, an expression here, and then the body of the match kind of block is made up of pairs of let's see, patterns, pattern followed by the standard, equals arrow, and a block. So I'm not sure the best way to actually capture this type of item in such a way that I can allow both blocks and individual expressions. That might be something to take a look at in this stream, but that is one limitation at the minute. Well, that and this other issue. So maybe what I'll do instead is I'll leave this one be and start with because I think in the example that I have in the other file that I had been starting from, because I haven't looked at it since, I think I had it actually working. So it might be a oh, hi Togglebit, thanks for joining again. So hi Archification, nice to meet you, and Atlasins. Oh, no problem. Thanks very much for tuning in though. So yeah, what I'll take a look at is my little kind of notes from before and a sample of where I had this running. And what I can do is try and get the same bit of code working here in this file. And from that point, I can then try and apply it in more places, basically. So if I take a look at where the index expression is being handled, let's see, am I in the same method? So this is in bind underscore. Yeah, so this is the same place. And so the piece that I had originally looked at was I was replacing these two lines with a single line. So it was going to be, and that could be one of the reasons why it wasn't working just now, was that I hadn't actually looked at the piece that was being returned from this. So this is being, nothing is being returned from this match expression. So I didn't have to handle that when I was kind of checking this out before. So that'll be something that I'll need to take a look at now. But for the moment, what I'll do is, just oh, thanks for the follow, IllusionMan1212. So if I grab this, so like I said, I've removed the kind of special handling of the error message. Instead, this is really just going to be hopefully a more or less drop-in replacement for these two lines in general. The one thing that will change as well is at the end, instead of what am I trying to say? Instead of it being an actual expression, because it's a macro invocation, I'll have to end it with a parentheses as well. So let's try that at least. No rules expected this token. So let's take a look. Oh yeah, so I had reverted my change from earlier. So what I'll do is get rid of that message, or that extra parameter. And then finally, so this is the same message as before. I have to encapsulate my blocks because of the current format that I have my macro rule matching. So let's take a look, line 31. Yeah, so I've removed that. And there we go. So that seems to be behaving as it did before. So now so a couple of things to follow on from that. In fact, I might just add them to the to-do so that I address each of them in time. So the first is to, let's see, allow expressions as well as blocks. And that's in match eval expression. And what I also want to do is, let's see, that's probably the main one actually. And just thinking about it now, I did have an example where I was, so going back to the previous example where I was trying to replace this piece, and it was failing because it was working with a reference instead of the Boolean, a reference to a variable instead of the Boolean itself. Whereas it should be feasible to just dereference that and get the behavior that I want. In fact, this is a follow-up refactoring that I'll be doing in a minute. I think that's what I'm actually doing here. Yeah, so I'm just dereferencing that. So maybe I'll take a look at that there. So I've just got a comment here. I'm writing a compiler for a 3D modeling DSL. Wow, that seems pretty intense. I haven't written any macros before. Are there any interesting applications of where macros might be particularly useful? Thanks very much for the question, Atlasins. So I suppose I'm guessing from the question that it's to do with that it's being developed in Rust, just because Rust's own macros are so different to macros in other languages. Oh, hi Gareth Hubble, thanks for joining. So so back to the question, the applications, I suppose it's yeah, it's probably one of these things that you'll probably get a very different opinion depending on who you ask. So, take my own thoughts with a pinch of salt. To me, macros, I suppose, are just another kind of form of meta programming, where instead of, you writing directly what variables you want to assign and what operations you want to achieve, that you're almost writing it at a higher level so that, you're not necessarily saying, okay, put value X into variable Y. You're actually saying put value X into a variable that I can define as I want based on the macro. So then if I have a repetitive pattern in terms of, for example, I have this pattern where I suppose a typical one is parsing JSON maybe, where if I want to take all of the variables out of a JSON object and create local variables that have the same names as the variables that exist in the object, I wouldn't necessarily, for example, if I was to do that in Rust here, and I was doing so if I had this JSON object, I don't know what's the best way to do this. So let object is equal to decode, JSON decode, and whatever JSON I have here, and then I end up with this kind of runtime based hash map perhaps, and then I wanted to go through it and assign each one to a local variable, such as let name is equal to object, and then I have a name, and then I have to do a question, or I might do a get, or in fact that is the get. So in that case I'd do a question mark to escape early, and then I might want to get age, and then I might want to get occupation. I suppose in that case, if we take a look at the pattern, there is this kind of repeated pattern of, declaring variables basically, and I can't necessarily abstract that using a standard function or a for loop, for example, because these are defining variables in a particular scope, and there's no kind of there typically isn't a language level abstraction unless you're in unless you have kind of um, I suppose very strong reflection in the language, reflection support. But then that's a I suppose another type of meta programming as well. And macros are just so if I was thinking about a compiler for 3D modeling DSL, I suppose to be honest, yeah, this probably wouldn't be the answer that you might be looking for, but it's one of these things where I would like it's an excite macros and all sorts of meta programming are very interesting and exciting applications in and of themselves, and they're very interesting to learn, but they're very much a tool that I would kind of hold off on using until I knew I had to, because trick the difficulty I see with meta programming in general, or the difficulty I see with it in general, is just how much more complicated it makes things in general, because you're not it's the same as a function. You're no longer writing code directly, you're writing an abstraction. And while abstractions can be useful, if you think about a macro and how you test a macro, it can be very easy to test the thing that the macro generates, like the code that the macro generates, but it can be very difficult to test a macro itself. For example, I'm even writing, this quite a simple macro. It does very little, but even then, I'm having, you know, uh, let me see my compiled stuff. So, you know, if I go to my macro rule and I want to say I have a coding convention where if I split things out onto separate lines, I like to have a comma at the end of each line. But then if I compile this doesn't actually work because I haven't handled that. This has to have a special, I think it looks like this maybe, or it might be that. Let's see. No, but I'd have to play around with it to make sure that that macro is kind of applicable in all sorts of scenarios. So, in terms to, I suppose, bring it back to the original question, are there any interesting applications of where my macros might be particularly useful? I suppose that example that I gave in terms of if you have sections where you need to bring kind of variables that are defined at runtime into a local scope almost, that can be quite useful. But it is kind of a thing where I would say, you know, it's nearly based on patterns, and I would try and identify what are the patterns I want to abstract. And my first, thanks for the follow, Gareth Hubble, and I see your comment as well, so I'll be checking that out in a second too. But I would first, any patterns that I identify, my first port of call is to attempt to abstract it using a function. And if I can't abstract it using a function, basically that's where I'd start looking at macros, because it's kind of a higher level of abstraction almost. Um, and and similarly, it's not necessarily that I go to macros as such, but I would go to meta programming. And the nice thing about macros for Rust is that it provides them out of the box, so it's easier to use those than to, for example, a type of meta programming that I'm very fond of is just code generation. I feel it's a lot simpler, and you potentially understand what's going on a little bit better. But again, it's more code, it's more complexity, it's tougher to test, I find. You generally want to be fairly sure that the kind of benefit outweighs the cost. The only I've kind of the only reason I'm applying macros here is because I've deferred it so long, and I've kind of identified this as something that if I implement this macro, it will have kind of far-reaching effects. So like I was saying earlier when I was searching through this file, any of these statements would probably be enhanced by this. So there's probably over a dozen of these where they would be enhanced by the macro. But again, I know that's a bit of a wishy-washy answer, but it's kind of, it's my kind of flake out way of saying it depends, but it really does. So I hope that helps a little bit at least. Just came back from some food and noticed that toggle's looking different. Oh yeah, sorry. So apologies. I'm not sure actually how Twitch rating works. So yeah, whether I've taken over the channel, I'm not sure. But welcome anyone who's joined anyway. Anyway, so with that all said, I'll get back into taking a look at this original condition that I was going to be refactoring to. So if I recall correctly, let's see, match eval expression is what we're using. So in this case, I would probably do let b equals match eval expression. I've got my bang. I need my match statement like that. I can copy these. These will need to go into blocks like so. And at that point, then I grab the parameters like that. And I can comment these out. And the thing that I wasn't doing before was, I wasn't dereferencing this Boolean. But it seems that there's still an issue here. Okay, and this could actually be to do with lifetimes at this point. The value doesn't live long enough. So, and it's being caused by, it's originating in the macro. So this macro invocation on line 167, so that's the one here, of course. And so what exactly is going wrong here? So is it because B is being returned here? I thought that, okay, so what happened before? So even though I've probably resolved the issue that I was looking at before, because the borrow checker runs at basically a step after the type checker. So if I remove this first, I'll probably get, yeah, so this is the, and it actually gives this advice now, consider dereferencing the borrow. And now that I've resolved that, I actually run into a lifetime issue, which I was somewhat expecting, but the dereferencing issue threw me a little. So this creates a temporary which is freed while still in use. So let me just take a look at, okay, so it's line 28. So the temporary is freed at the end of the statement. And, oh no, line 32. Yeah, so this defines a block somewhat, and the semicolon down here, this is a little tricky. Question from our comment from Artification. Just curious, how long have you been writing Rust? I find the borrow checker and compiler message to be very helpful most of the time, but Rust is also the first compiled language I ever actually learned. C always scared me from learning because of how easy it is to do things unsafely. Absolutely. So I haven't personally been writing much Rust for too long. I suppose before this project, which I've been working on mostly during weekends for the last number of months, probably since about halfway through the year. Before that, um, it was mainly I was mainly working on, yeah, a few small projects. So when I say small, kind of in the realms of, I wrote a tool to kind of fetch things from Git repositories. So there was a bit of I don't think there was much networking, but there was dealing with just kind of calling command line programs. There was also, did I have one or two other quite small projects in a similar vein? Maybe there was a bit of networking in there um, at some point, but in general, yeah, I think my original kind of like my original look into Rust was a couple of years ago, but I did actually have to have a few attempts before I could, feel comfortable writing the language. Just because borrows and working with the borrow checker was just kind of quite a significant hurdle for me to get over. I agree that about the borrow checker and compiler messages, especially even the way the compiler can suggest fixes for your code almost to get you over some hurdles can be very useful. And from what I've encountered, 9 times out of 10, the thing that it suggests is the thing that I do want. Um, I don't think I've introduced any bugs as a result of following the compiler's advice. But there are still some times where, either, yeah, I suppose it's that classic thing of, ultimately the compiler can guess what you're trying to do, but there's only so far it can guess that. And and here's a good example where, I'm not necessarily sure I think what the compiler is advising me to do. Um, and yeah, despite of all its complaining, the Rust compiler feels like a friend, definitely, and a safety net. I had a lecturer in college who had, you know, uh, I'm not sure was it advice, but just a comment to make about Haskell, in that you do spend quite a lot of time, kind of, especially starting out with Haskell, battling against the type checker to just get things working. But more often than not, your code tends to work, quite well first time around once you do get it compiling. And I do feel a similar way with Rust, in that it gets you very much to kind of frame your thoughts in such a way that once you do finally get over all those hurdles, your initial code is better for it. Cargo half of the time consider borrowing here. Yeah. And I'm I often do just kind of defer to the borrow checker's suggestions in those cases. Just yeah, do what the compiler tells me, and it seems to work out most of the time, so that's good. Um, but on C as well, yeah, C is a bit of a um, yeah, is a bit scary in that regard. And looking back on C and stuff that I've done in C through the lens of this, or even looking at this project and considering how easy how much easier I could have written it in C in one sense, but also how easily I could have shot myself in the foot at a number of different decision points, where I basically just wasn't allowed to in Rust. Now, there will be consequences of that I'll get into in future streams. I've even been thinking about some of them recently, but for the most part, it's at least brought to my attention a lot of issues that I otherwise would have overlooked. Um, just reading Artification's comment. Yeah, that's an interesting point, and it's something that, funnily enough, before I came to Rust, it's one of these funny things. Like, I do find sometimes in the programming community at large, it's funny how different groups or different individuals can almost come up with converging ideas or ways of thinking at a similar point in time. Um, because I remember even before coming to Rust, thinking about this idea of ownership with regards to processing I/O with networking. And I remember I just did something that was, you know, just not very smart in that I was doing a project where I was working with, I made a connection to a client or server, and I had the byte stream, and I at one point passed the byte stream kind of I suppose interface to a decorator, to a wrapper that would then mean that it was kind of like almost like a buffered line reader. So it added additional processing around the byte stream so that you weren't working with a raw byte stream anymore. It was kind of decorated. But what I was using that in general, but then there was one part where I was like, okay, you know, I could do this in there was a little section of the code where I was like, I'm just going to reach into the byte stream directly and take what I want out for the next part, because you know I just wanted some bit of information that I wanted to use before I moved on to the next bit of properly encoded stream. I know this is very abstract, but essentially what happened was, I ended up with errors in my code because what I had done was implicitly assigned ownership of the byte stream to that kind of buffered reader. And of course, what the buffered reader did was it read more than it needed to of the stream, or it read ahead. So, for example, if it wanted to read a JSON object that was 10 characters long, it doesn't know ahead of time that it's going to be 10 characters long. So it has a buffer of, say, a thousand bytes. And so it fills the buffer as much as it can. So it might have read 20 bytes and returned the first 10. And then I was trying to reach into the original byte stream to get the subsequent 10, but the buffer had already read past that point, and I was getting these errors that I didn't understand at the time. But once I was thinking that, I was thinking, well, really, I should have structured that so that that byte stream is only owned by one area, or by one variable almost. And then subsequently, I kind of happened upon Rust, and I was like, that makes so much sense. Like the you know the borrow checker kind of actually was able to encode into rules and these kind of in this informal idea that I was kind of coming to think about my programs. Um, so but yeah, I think I think the borrow checker as well is just one of those really great, one of the most kind of innovative developments, I think, in programming in recent years as well, because it's one of these things that um, I suppose I've looked into a number of programming languages over the years, and I think the thing that people recognize about you know learning new programming languages, more than almost being able to be more efficient or be more succinct or clear. Like I think a lot of programming languages are equivalent in the sense of, if a program is going to be complicated in one language, you're going to be, I think writing in a pure functional language or writing in an imperative language, is going to be kind of complicated either way. But I think learning new languages does help you think about things differently. And I think that is a really, like, same way coming to a Haskell from an imperative style, I think the same amount of learning can be given to someone who originally started with a functional language coming to an imperative style. Um, approaching that issue through the lens of Rust. might be a good idea to have the buff reader and you hand those bytes as opposed to making something else to take them or reference them. Um, Hand you those bytes as opposed to making something else take them or reference them. I don't fully understand that, sorry, but I suppose just on that topic, like what I was thinking about after the fact, when I again before I learned of Rust and things like that, was I was thinking if I did want to handle this in a proper way, shall we say, I would have had this. Yeah, I think I was writing it in Go as well, so again, very easy to do the wrong thing there. Or no, I'll go new. Uh, but I think I was thinking about it as something like, so I had this reader, and it was defined as, you know, a var IO reader, and it was probably called in, and I probably wrapped it in a new buff reader, or it probably wasn't even a buff reader. It was probably like, you know, JSON object reader, something like that. And I read each object it encountered in the input stream, and then I, you know, did something like object in, and then, you know, read obj, and then I did probably something like yeah, in read, you know, a single byte, something, or I don't know, yeah, I don't want to get too bogged down with the syntax, but trying to make it legible. And then when I was thinking about it anyway, if what I should have done instead of going directly to in is again thinking about it in the Rust style, I should have asked if I did want to get that stream back, I should have asked for it back basically from the object in the object stream, and said, you know, stream, and then that would then no longer be usable, but I'd then have in back again, and I'd be able to read from in, and object in could then recreate that stream with it has knowledge that it has read ahead, and it could do kind of extra calculations to give that back in a sense. Um, and that's something I think that would be achievable, and would be kind of almost your only way of doing it in Rust. That if you want to get access back to that underlying stream, you have to ask for it from the thing you gave it to, which makes sense in a lot of ways, I think. Um, Spambot. Oh, actually, Atlas Ins. Thanks very much. I really appreciate that. I had been thinking about how to get those. So banned phrases list. I'll take a look at that. In fact, do I have a bit of paper? I'll just make a note of that there, because yeah, I've been thinking about that. All right, and in the chat itself, I didn't see a good way of removing it. So banned phrase list. Yeah, very good idea. Thank you. And yeah, styles, procedural and imperative. Object side of the fence doesn't like complexity on my side. I don't like the entrapment of you have to use an object or else. Yeah, very much so. And yeah, it's a funny one, the object orientation piece. Um, I yeah, I definitely wouldn't subscribe to the idea of, you know, having everything object orientated. And I actually sometimes feel that in terms of carrying state, I think that just kind of regular structures make a lot of sense, rather than this kind of idea of you have to bundle state and behavior. I think that can be useful in terms of computed properties, that you have, okay, if you have this property that's based on other fields, then, you know, it can serve to reduce um, redundancy and storing redundant fields, which is its own source of errors. But I suppose what I don't like then is storing too much behavior. I suppose the object orientation in and of itself can lead to this case of, I suppose it's, I don't know, this is probably getting more into philosophy of programming and a bit of a digression, but it leads me to thinking of the classic case of where you kind of learn about inheritance first, and you're like, okay, well, now I have this tool in my belt. I need everything to be this cool inherited architecture, and I'm going to define these really perfect objects at the top of my inheritance tree, and it's going to make everything really slick. And you kind of, it's one of these areas where I feel it's very easy to take things too far, and yeah, that's what object orientation to me sometimes feels like, is taking an idea that doesn't need to, it's just, but I suppose it's the same with all of these disciplines, same with kind of writing everything as functions, sometimes it makes sense for a function to be almost paired with state, because, or like a group of functions to have a state that is shared between them, because you know it you know those functions will always need that state, or will always be called in the context of that state. Again, a bit abstract, but I suppose I'd probably be similar in that I'd be more on this. I try to limit how many kind of raw objects I have, in terms of coupled behavior and state. But it's it's one of these things where I think arguments can be made for both approaches, and the ideal approach probably lies somewhere in the middle. And again, it comes down to the problem at hand too. Um, and in Rust, you have something that feels like an object, um, in the form of struct, and that's the thing as well, because end of the day, sometimes it's like that. Is it Nora Jones? The line between them is the length of a spider's thread. In that, there, and Python even takes this idea further. But like, end of the day, there is very little difference between struct object, whoops, and a function, uh, you know, defined on that object that takes it as a parameter, versus if I was to use kind of Go style, or yeah, there. How do I write this? Maybe, yeah, if I have function f, there can be so little difference between uh, the two of these a lot of the time, and sometimes that's kind of what object-oriented programming boils down to, is that you're just writing your function calls on your context object, in a different syntax. Now that isn't quite true, because the one thing about this is that the object is actually somewhat bound to f, and that can have its own benefits, definitely, for a lot of reasons. But a lot of the time, it really is just kind of nearly a stylistic difference almost. And you know the benefit of this sometimes is actually decoupling. Not every uh, function that takes a certain parameter needs to be defined on that parameter. Yeah, anyway, that was a bit of a digression, but Atlas, since my first language was Java, so yeah, it's very difficult to, and especially because Java is one of these things that takes the object-oriented thing so far, in that everything is an object, or you can't actually define standalone functions. It is interesting, but at the same time, I think there are lots of you know, as I've experienced more languages after Java as well, there's a number of points that I've come to appreciate about the kind of consistency and simplicity of Java. But yeah, in terms of like it kind of is a nice idea that everything is an object, but it does somewhat limit your uh, I suppose, yeah, it does somewhat limit how you're able to think about problems then, as with any language, I suppose, and just trying to get more exposure to different languages really is the only way. Um, Inheritance reminds me of the 100 JS frameworks you need to build a large project like Inheritance, but in a meta way. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, so anyway, thanks very much for the discussion. It's really nice to talk about this stuff. Um, Please, yeah, keep the comments coming in as well if you feel like it. So just continuing on here, so I am up against this uh, kind of borrowing issue that I'm not fully sure how to resolve. I know how to resolve it in isolation, but now I'm working on it in the context of a macro, so it kind of adds an extra dimension of difficulty to this. So let's see. Excuse me. Borrowed value doesn't live long enough. That's happening online. In fact, if I split these screens up like this, and where was I here? So the issue seems to be that this is being borrowed up until this point, but so it's being dropped here, and it's being used where exactly? I'm not fully following this one. It's I think it's pointing to the top here, so it's pointing to either there or there. I'm not sure. Either way, both of those points look like they're within the bounds of where it can be used. So in this macro invocation, okay, so that's um, referencing the whole invocation. And so it's saying the borrow is later used within this whole match statement. But the value is don't often find someone willing to go into philosophy. Oh yeah, that's maybe a bit too much of a problem for me because I'm all too quick to jump into philosophy because I suppose yeah it's just something that interests me. Um, I suppose I have a big interest in kind of yeah why we do the things we do and yeah I'm not sure how to describe it really, but because at the end of the day, there also is just so much, there is the practical side to programming, and it really is most of what we do is the practical side, but there also is kind of a theoretical side as well, very much so. Um, and and I think the domain of programming languages is something that is often viewed, again, talking about viewing things through lenses. Programming languages often are viewed through the lens of productivity and brass tacks. And, oh, if I write this in a function style, it's objectively better than if I wrote it in an object oriented style. And I can give examples and things like that. But a lot of the time, these really, while they can often be presented in an objective way, it really comes down to, someone prefers to write something in one way because I at least I'm not going to say I read these papers or articles, but I read uh, a long time ago, or maybe skimmed these articles on different approaches to designing an OS, I think. And one was an event-driven style where each event in the system triggered like sent a message to another subsystem, and there were handlers for those. And then the other one was, I suppose, probably a more synchronous based approach where you probably had imperative function calls that returned, and then you could continue on from there. And I think there were two articles that went into different approaches, and the kind of conclusion at the end really was both approaches have merit, and neither was necessarily better than the other, because what you gained from one, basically both had their strong points and both had their weak points. And what you kind of gained in one, you lost in areas that the other side was weak in. And I think that applies to programming languages as well, in that, they're like, it's almost these cross-cutting concerns, and these have even been kind of mostly documented and appreciated in the sense of with object oriented style. I can't actually remember the exact dimensions, but the basic idea being that if you define a lot of objects, for example, and if you used an inheritance style, as you're growing your project, if you've been defining it in terms of objects and you have all these objects that are kind of related, at a certain point, it's easier to define new functionality in terms of new objects with the same kind of function definition structure as the rest of the objects, and you can very easily extend your program in that way by adding new objects. But it's very difficult then to define new behavior for one object, because if they're, for example, all following the same interface or something, then all of the other objects in the system have to be extended with that function and be defined for that function. So I say function, more like method, things like that, but I'm not going to sweat the terminology. But on the converse, then in a system that's kind of, sorry, I've guessed, in a system that's functionally defined, you can very easily extend it with lots and lots of functions, and you might have a function that you might have all these functions that define their behavior on different, say, variants of an enum, and they're all well defined individually, and it's very easy to then define new functions and new behavior. But if you then modify any of the objects, you have to go back and update all your functions to be able to handle that new type of object, for example. And I suppose at the end of the day, it's funny for both of those examples, I think, of, say, procedural based systems versus event based ones, and functional versus object orientated. They're nearly, I would say, almost at completely right angles to each other, like completely orthogonal. Um, and when you get to that point, it really is a point of neither is necessarily better than the other. They both have their strengths and weaknesses, and it's. I find it funny that oftentimes you will find that the opposites, the weak points of one style will literally be the strengths of the opposite style. I don't know. Again, probably rambling a little bit, but um, so the current theoretical side does inform the future practical side. Yeah, very much so. Uh, but I suppose we are, like I would say so. But it is probably one of those things that lags somewhat, and I suppose we do live in a, I suppose, not to get too political, but a societal structure that at the end of the day, a an idea nearly has to have value in order for it to be kind of you know the you know uh, programming in and of itself is a very interesting thing, but it's say business value and things like that that for better or worse ultimately drives you know what is something that's useful, and what what's something that people are going to spend time on, and kind of pay people to spend time on. Whereas I suppose philosophy is interesting to think about, but unless people get paid to do it, it's probably not going to be done quite as much as the practical stuff. Any intuition for lifetimes, like we've learned to mentally design with borrowing in mind. Only find using lifetimes to shut the compiler up rather than a conscious design decision on my part. Oh, and thanks for the follow, Mr. Glitchbite. So, yeah, that's a very interesting question, a very good question. I think. Is there an intuition I have for lifetimes? I suppose, like I feel like I do. There are aspects that still, there's still so much of the time that I'm kind of not necessarily surprised by what the borrow checker has to say to me, but definitely a lot of times where there are aspects that I forgot about or overlooked or things like that. But I suppose yeah, it really comes down to ownership and where data should exist. It is a tricky question. Like, because at at a design point, yeah, I suppose there's no one size fits all answer to this one, I would say, unfortunately. Um, because yeah, I suppose the intuition unfortunately just comes with application, doesn't it? It's similar to, again, functional programming. Once you start getting into the likes of Haskell after coming from an imperative background, it's really just unintuitive. Like, you have to define your while loops in terms of recursion, and lazy evaluation, rather than just what could be considered a more straightforward imperative style. Um, but with doing that enough time, you just kind of get into that way of thinking. With and with Rust, I suppose, just the more that I've done it anyway, the more and again, I suppose I had a bit of a head start because I identified some of those aspects when I was writing in Go and the likes. But I suppose what Rust really just brings to the forefront is the idea that your data has to exist somewhere, and where it exists is ultimately going to come down to where it needs to be used. So, a really nice thing about that is, if you have data that doesn't have to be used everywhere, that you can localize it, and the compiler nearly forces you into a way of thinking that if you don't need it everywhere, it kind of forces you to define a narrow scope where it can be used. And similarly, if you do have to use it everywhere, it just forces you to think about what are what are the compromises almost you have to make to get that happen. Is this a thing that you can create once, and from that point on, it's used everywhere, but it's used um, in a read-only way? In that case, you can probably use a reference, to it throughout. So you can have it mutable at the start and then have a reference to it everywhere. but is it that, but you might then decide, okay, it's actually something that will have to be updated at some point. And then the question comes, okay, what is the nature of that mutability? Is it the case that a single actor will be able to mutate it, and then all the other actors who rely on that information will get, you know, will be updated in real time almost, and then you might actually start thinking, okay, well, that's actually more like a broadcast system, so I'll use a message bus or something like that, and I won't even use shared memory. Or it might be a thing where multiple actors can modify it, such as in, I'm writing a programming language here, there might be multiple threads, and I want to have a mechanism for having two threads update the same value. In order to prevent both of them from updating it at the same time, then the value has to be wrapped in a mutex so that it can be shared across threads. Um, yeah, I'm not sure I have necessarily an intuitive model as such. I suppose the closest thing I would have to an intuitive model, but it's not necessarily something unique to Rust, I would say, is just the idea that in gen, this is probably very broad, and some people might be angry at me for saying this, but in general, all data in the system, for the most part, should kind of come from the main function. Um, that, no matter what leaves, like what leaf functions you're calling or what they're doing, even if they're creating data themselves, the data that they're creating should, in some way or form, through, for example, factories or parsing or some form of another, is all linked to some kind of origin in main. And it's almost main at that point, the main function at that point, that defines the lifetime for all these things. Um, and that's a really good place to think. Now, Rust is nice as well because it allows you to, at the lower levels, define very explicitly the lifetimes and the scopes of data. But if you think about a language that doesn't have lifetimes, for example, it's very easy in Go to have a library, for example, that creates a connection to a server. So it just starts a request, creates a connection, and then returns the connection to another function that could pass it to somewhere totally different in the system. And the risk there is that that connection is essentially leaked at that point. Similarly, with Go routines, it's very easy to leak them. Um, and the difficulty there is who then cleans that up, who defines when to close that connection, because only the current possessor of that connection knows when it's finished with, and even then they might not have enough information from that. So when you have these kind of setups where data can just kind of flow through a system, without kind of regard to ownership or lifetimes, deciding what should be responsible for cleanup a lot of the time becomes a big issue. Whereas if all data kind of originates, whether through factories or through dependency injection or one of these kind of forms, if all data kind of originates from main in some form, then I think at least main can even indirectly kind of constrain the lifetimes of different sections of the code base, and so that data is properly at least cleaned up properly. And that's kind of what a lot of, I feel, the benefit of lifetimes is as well, is that data can be properly cleaned up after it's been used, because the compiler knows exactly when everything um, the compiler knows how long everything should last, and when it can be safely cleaned up. Um, think of a banana, you need to own the banana to eat it, so you take it down from the tree before eating it. And the other bananas that are still on the tree are clones of the banana, and other people might take ownership and eat those. If you take a picture of a banana, you wouldn't eat the reference of the banana. That's an interesting analogy. I hadn't thought of that one. And so, is there an intuition to be found for designing with lifetimes? Um, let me th so designing with lifetimes, very good questions. I suppose they're not necessarily things that I've thought about in and of themselves. Again, they're more kind of personal intuitions that I've probably developed inside myself, but probably haven't articulated before. Um, Intuition for designing with lifetimes. I think what you mentioned about just actually doing what the compiler says. I mean, the borrow checker itself is the best judge of. Oh, that's no problem at all. It's a pleasure to chat about this stuff. I think just just following the borrow checker's advice is, and making mistakes. I suppose you develop that intuition necessarily. You don't necessarily need to start out with it, I would say. And what I would like to say as well is, end of the day, the borrow checker is hugely useful, but at the same time, it's not, omnipotent or like all knowing. I like to think that the solutions for problems in computer, or the solutions to problems in programming, don't necessarily come from from the computer operator or the computer itself. The answer usually lies somewhere in the middle. Um, so even taking the idea of unit tests are very useful for helping us kind of prevent regressions and catch errors in our code. But at the end of the day, the the unit tests are only one side of the equation. If I write a unit test and it fails, it's the computer telling me that something's wrong, but it's up to me to decide, okay, is the computer correct in telling me that that's wrong? Or am I the one who's right? Is my program right? And it's actually the test that's wrong. Because that can often happen too. And I suppose the answer usually lies somewhere in the middle, but even to even get to that point, does require, I suppose, a lot of familiarity with the borrow checker. And I certainly am not at that level where I could, it's not necessarily that the borrow checker would be wrong. Like it knows if its rules have been invalidated, but it's up to you to decide whether the yeah uh once the borrow checker highlights an issue, the point then comes, do you say that the borrow checker is right and you just follow its advice, and if you do this change that the borrow checker advises, that your program will then be complete or correct? Or is it the point that the compiler has highlighted some I suppose failed assumption that you then have to rectify in the code, rather than just kind of following the borrow checker's advice? But again, it's, yeah, well, I wouldn't say that I've developed that intuition at this point yet anyway. So yeah, it won't be my place to advise on it, I don't think. And yeah, that's a good point. Artification. It's same with all of these kind of things. I think there's skills, and it's the tricky thing as well. Like I certainly, when I started with Rust, you know, because I had what I suppose I would call a number of failed attempts with learning Rust. It was only kind of my third time round that I was able to kind of stick with a project long enough to complete it. That you know there's a certain level of kind of almost learning things from scratch again. So it is tricky, but then the payoff is that um you really can, once you understand it on a slightly deeper level, you can apply it to other problems and other languages as well. Yeah, absolutely. Um, so yeah, so where was I then in terms of this program that's kind of get or this problem that's getting the better of me? Speaking of lifetimes, um, so the issue here is that a value is dropped while still borrowed. I suppose that's the crux of the issue. And it's saying that the value defined in here is dropped when it's borrowed. Could I do something like this? I'll just give it a bad name for the moment, just to see if that will extend its lifetime enough that it could resolve the issue. So I need to resolve the mutability issue there first. Can't move, can't move out of the reference. So that came from me. So that would probably need to go down there, would it? And that's probably actually going to result in the that's probably going to result in the same thing, is that yeah, borrowed value doesn't live long enough. And maybe, and I can't do it like that. And move occurs because it doesn't have copy and I need to borrow it. I'm getting into all kinds of hairy situations here now because, oh yeah, so I don't need to do that anymore. Yeah, so I'm actually, I'm basically just after moving the same thing to the line before. So maybe if I look at it a different way, so the borrow is used in this match statement, and the temporary value is freed afterwards. So I'm not quite sure why it's saying that it's write the value to a file. Yeah, I'd say that would work. Um, yeah, so every value evaluation would go through file IO. I did say from the outset though that performance isn't the goal of this language, so it would at least work within the parameters of the rules I've defined. So just might take a couple of days for Hello World to evaluate. So let's see what and so it's in this macro invocation. Borrow is later used here. I am finding this one tricky because it does seem like the temporary value is freed after the so it's saying the borrow is later used here. Yeah, or a quantum computer has to be run on, yeah, a quantum CPU. So okay, and so actually there are some notes. It's saying consider using a let binding to create a longer lived value. So that's actually what this was intended to accomplish originally. This moving, this had originally been in here, in line almost, but it got moved to a let to kind of follow this this advice. But it doesn't seem to be helping out anymore. And just out of morbid curiosity, what would happen if I removed the semicolon there? No change, and same there. Well, something happened there. I'm not sure for better or worse, but macro expansion ignores the token let and any tokens following, I assume. Let expressions. So it seems to be, I seem to be messing up the evaluation of the AST at that point. So I'll probably put that double brace back in. What would happen if you let mutable unlocked value? I think, yeah, good question. Oh, I took out my brackets again, but let's try that. 1080p for better text readability. Yes, that's a good point, actually. I think my internet would allow it. Now, my internet can be a bit flaky. I suppose I'm going by the yeah. It's a good point. I might experiment with that at some point. All right. It's I have kind of erred on the point of probably trying to have my font a little bigger and stream in a slightly lower resolution, just because of I suppose not too much confidence in the internet connections around here. But yeah, that's a good point. It might be something that would be worth looking into. Again, it's something that I suppose in my kind of enthusiasm to just get something up and running, I haven't been looking too much into tweaking things or getting what's the word? I suppose just kind of an optimal experience. I don't even have a proper microphone or things like that. But now that I've been doing it for a few months, it might be worth checking out stuff like that. So yeah, thanks for the suggestion. So so there, yeah, the variable in that case doesn't seem to need to be mutable. So just for the moment anyway, I'll remove that again. But let's see. And is it mainly coming from the fact that, so if I removed, now this will result in other errors. Well, maybe it won't, but let's see what happens if I remove those bits. Yeah, so that actually compiles the issue, and that's funny actually, that the issue seems to be from introducing an assignment in this case. Yeah, and if I take a look at my, say, crib sheet from before, I had a function that more or less does the same thing, except so it's still returning a value. Oh, I wonder. Maybe if I dereference that, is okay. Yeah, that okay. I'm yeah very. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not not that good at Rust, but yeah. So the issue there being that I was doing this. I was like, okay, I'll dereference it afterwards. But what was, I suppose, happening, at least as far as I can understand it, is that so what's happening in this expression essentially is I'm evaluating this AST item. And in this language, when a value is eventually kind of evaluated, it's put into an arc mutex so that it's essentially its own kind of memory cell almost. And so it can be easily passed throughout the system. It's probably not the most efficient. I think I will be encountering runtime penalties for doing it that way, but it at least works for the moment. So what's happening in this section is I have evaluated that expression. I've created this mutex protected value, and in the context of match eval expression, I take it out of its mutex so that it can actually be acted upon in this match statement. And that's what I'm doing here is I'm essentially saying, okay, what was the value that was actually in that protected bit of memory? And then I take the actual Boolean out of it and return it. However, this, as it stands, this is the Boolean within the mutex, and I'm just brazenly trying to return it out of the mutex guard and into this variable. So that was what was making it look like the value's lifetime was extending beyond this, because it kind of was, because it was being put in here. So the solution then is to actually dereference it. In this case, it just copies the value because it's a kind of a primitive value, and so we're no longer trying to pull out that value itself, but we're pulling out a copy of that value and putting it into a local variable. Okay, that makes sense now. Little silly of me as usual, but and let's see if the semicolon causes any issues. No, that seems to be all right. So okay, that's finally that resolved, and I've learned a big lesson there. Now some things that still need to be addressed. So I still want to apply this in more locations. Something that still needs to be addressed is, ideally, I could now I wonder, could I make that slightly easier as well? No, it would probably confuse things too much, but I would like if I could replace those blocks with just expressions at my own discretion. So if, for example, if I wanted to, I could still have a block there and an expression in this point. Someone stole the banana between pulling it down and eating it. Yeah, good point. How would I express this with the banana metaphor? Yeah, it's nearly akin to, so I have my banana, and whenever I create whenever a new banana gets grown, it has its skin on it. It's perfectly intact. And what I did was I opened it to actually, do whatever to it. I don't know, check the color on the inside to make sure it wasn't bruised. And then what I did was I tried to actually, um, I don't know, put it back in, like if I'm at a shop or if I'm with the banana tree, I tried to put it back on the tree, but also take the banana out of it. So I was basically just putting the empty skin back on the tree and trying to brazenly hold on to the banana itself. Whereas what I needed to do in this case, it'll probably stretch the metaphor a bit, but I needed to open the banana, take it out, see what color it was, or see if it had bruising, make a clone of it, so somehow pop another copy of that color in and banana into existence, put the original banana back in its skin, seal it back up, put it back in the tree, and then I have this clone of the banana that I can then reference down here in order to actually perform logic. Yeah, very, very good point. Thanks for keeping me honest, Atlas, since Banana Factory, of course. So, yeah. So, yeah. So next bit then is I'd like to take a look at just playing around with the macros a bit more. So if I look at Rust macro and so if I compile this, it says no rules expected this token. So that's an issue coming from here. And at the moment, if I jump back here, at the moment, only a block is allowed in this value position. So that's fine in this second branch, but this first branch is no bueno. Luckily, the cloning facility on the island. Yes, of course, I forgot about that. But we live in modern times. Reskinning bananas, yeah. So, so what I want to do now is take a look at how is it even possible? I'm not sure, but how can I potentially allow both a block and an expression in this section? So let's take a look. So there's function like macros, attribute like macros. I think the one that I want though is a regular. Is just a regular macro. Yeah, procedural no, that's the second form. What's the declarative macros? So I just want a declarative macro, but I want to be able to, yeah, I mean, the Rust book is just so comprehensive, but it's also very succinct, which I'm very impressed by. I mean, some of the chapters really are just almost a bit of sample code with a bit of text afterwards. And I know for me, it's often enough. Maybe it's not as hand-holdy, but no, I'm very impressed with the Rust book. Um, If you're making a language, would it be difficult to make your source formatting in the same shape as the logo for the language? And the donut-shaped donut, yes, I think so. And the donut-shaped donut that generates a rotating 3D donut. Yeah, those are and there's also is it the Ouroboros code where it are the queens or coins, I can never remember the names of them, but where it writes its own source code in a different language. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I'll be honest, I'm unlikely to attempt that in my language anyway. So, but anyone out there watching this is free to attempt that. I'm not sure how yeah. Oh yeah, no, it's kind of I'm so impressed by that thing. I can't even kind of big. I think I've looked into it a little bit, like how it works, but I can't even begin to comprehend how it goes. So macro rules. Okay, so that's Rust by example. Um, so one thing I might check out as well, I think is called Maplit for Rust. It's a library that I've used before, and it I think it could have similar rules to probably what I'm wanting to do. So it has a hash map macro, which is doing something similar. Oh, I wonder, could I? Hmm, maybe. I wonder, could I do kind of a syntax here where, okay, I'll just put that back in place for the moment. just so it's compiling. I'm hardly allowed to just remove those. No, it would have to be one or the other. No, that's all right though. Um, would that make more sense with no, I think it makes more sense the way it is. Mm. Yeah, that's a good point. Archification. I think they might get around some of those issues actually potentially with Docker and being able to kind of install kind of specific versions of compilers because I would say that would definitely play a part in it as well. Um, so maplet source, let's see, and I'm looking for a hash map here. And so what does hash map take? So that takes expressions. Blocks probably aren't allowed in those expressions, are they? If they were, it would be great. Oh, that looks promising. Okay, so okay, that's very interesting. So a block is, if a block is specified here, then it'll only allow blocks. But an expression includes blocks, so that's kind of nice. So I can actually remove those. I can remove that and put that in. Let's see, do that. Oh, hey, unavailable user 5. Yes, sure, VIP for always supporting the chat. So just say thanks very much. I don't really know what to do with the VIP tokens as well. So, but just wanted to say thanks. So, so even though that is now working for the most part, it's now failing on something else. So it was working when I had that and I had return error, wasn't it? Oh no, it's not anymore. Okay, it had been. I thought it had been compiling. Oh, maybe I hadn't actually tested it with expressions. It just compiled when it was a block as well. And so if I do that, oh yeah, but you always ask me how I'm doing, so and I appreciate that. So while parsing the match arm, starting here, expected one of those are an operator. So basically, when it was trying to match this key pattern, and does it say the specific line that failed? Like, was it on this matter pattern or this pattern? Oh, definitely a very important programmer. So expected one of those. Now, why would that be the case? So that gets removed anyway. So I don't think I need to worry about the spacing. So while parsing the match arm, starting here. So that would be the likes of this. I hardly need to remove the commas there, do I? No, that definitely makes things break. And just out of curiosity, to get past the macro invocation step, no, that doesn't work either. Oh, nice. Yeah, I'm actually not sure what the features are. Like, I'll admit that I'm not too well versed on the Twitch setup, so I can't provide much help there. But I am confused by this. So it's originating in that macro invocation, and it was expecting an ending brace or a comma or a question mark. I wonder if I remove this branch, does it still have the same? So it possibly is an issue with having I wonder, should I have my comma in there as well? Whoops, jumped to the wrong line. Nice, brilliant. That was, yeah, as good as the general Rust errors are. I suppose again owing to the. In fact, it was probably telling me, yeah, line 30. Why didn't I just look at that? So if I go back in time now and take a look at what was the issue. So while parsing the match arm starting there, expecting that, and it was meant to be that. Yeah, that probably yeah is a little confusing. I suppose it's one of these things as well where you know error messages, the more you see them, kind of the more you just recognize them and know intuitively what they mean. And I suppose since macros in general are a feature that I don't use too much, it takes a while to actually parse myself what the compiler is looking for. So hopefully I'm now in a position that I can do that. Oh yeah, please feel free to continue lurking. So okay, no, there's another error. So the incompatible values. So yeah, I just need to wrap that in. Although, oh no, I still need to have that be a return because the branches need to be because that then won't have an effect on the type returned by this whole expression. Okay, so cool. I think I'm finally in a in a setup where I can start migrating more of the rest of the code to this new style. So if I were to do this match eval statement in the same way, I should be able to do that and still get the same result. Yeah. So I think I'll be able to apply that in a couple more places. Let's take a look though. In this case, what's happening? So I don't really have an opportunity to change that here. It's matching the right hand side, which is a valref with source, which is all so that's already been evaluated. So this match eval expression is when we have a pre-evaluated expression. So it doesn't really have much benefit to us there, but it does here. And in fact, I'll keep on this screen, I'll keep a reference of how it's used. So here we would have so I've handled the first one earlier already. Here I would do so this would be swap to a location, and we get rid of that. Again, really not saving many bytes here or lines. It's really just that it's at the point where there are just so many occurrences of this kind of pattern that it actually makes any sense to start applying this as to even create a general macro to address it. Now let's see if those three have worked. Yeah, it's at least compiling now. Unfortunately, I haven't been disciplined enough to do to unit test all of this as I've been going along, so I can't replace that. Well, it's less about discipline and more about I just haven't figured out exactly how I want to structure it just yet. So there could be runtime errors with this, but hopefully, just because the refactoring itself is fairly simple, hopefully it'll just work out. So let's try that, and we have item name. Where is value coming from there? That's an interesting one, because there's an operation that happens in between there, so I can't and it changes the operation depending on the setup. Just an idea, if there was a challenge event where you had to create a new language that had the worst performance possible, write a fork bomb into the compiler and hope it's done before you run out of RAM. Find out that it actually requires a lot of space and time to be able to compile Hello World. That's an interesting idea. It does actually somewhat remind me of, I think back in the day, back where, a lot of this stuff was being done a lot more by hand than we do it now, I guess. But back in the days where, for example, programs were being distributed probably by Usenet and floppy disks and things, there was, I believe, quite a big issue raised at one point about how, yeah, it's kind of a tricky one to probably explain, but a lot of the compilers that people were using, if they were, because a lot of them were kind of pre-built, or how do I explain it? So a lot of the compilers, the way they started out life was they got bootstrapped by a simpler compiler. So, for example, what you would, if memory serves correctly and if I understood it correctly, to get, for example, a C compiler or a Pascal compiler, you know, back in the day, those would have to be written. Yes, well, Rust, we have the likes of LLVM now, but back in the day, if you wanted to have a C compiler, for example, then there was no C compiler to write C in. So what do you do? So the likes of C and Pascal, those compilers would have the original compilers for them anyway would have to be written in the likes of assembly or something like it. So what would potentially have to happen, but that would be kind of very tedious, very error prone, things like that. So I think in general, what you'd do is you'd actually write a subset of the language in the likes of assembly, and then you would write the rest of the language in the language itself. So, for example, if I wanted to write, Yeah, well, exactly. So each language in general, you can't until it's feature, or if you write a programming language, you can't write it in itself until you have itself as a compiler. And so you to generally bootstrap some of these, you'd have to build the compiler in a subset of the language itself. And then so you'd write in assembly, I guess, a version of C, or you could write it in Pascal maybe if those existed already. But you'd write a version of the C compiler that just had enough information to write the C programming language in itself. The problem there, though, is that, again, that there probably wasn't as much memory or, disk space and things back then. What would often happen, if I understand, is that once you had bootstrapped your compiler, you'd kind of throw away the original, the bootstrapping piece. So now you just have a compiler, and it's a compiler that takes a source code for whatever language, and produces an executable corresponding to that input. Um, and then, once you have your new compiler, well, if you decided to extend the C programming language, again, you have all your C source code, and you could write, okay, I'm going to define a new feature for C, and then you compile that, and now you have your new compiler. So you have this kind of chain of compilers being built from, you know, in themselves, from themselves, almost like that. But the problem is that the bootstrapping only really happened once at the start, and people were just building off of more and more um, pre-existing binaries, I guess. And what someone highlighted at one point, I think it was probably a paper for what are those magazines, ASM or something. What someone highlighted is the fact that if you receive an executable or a compiler from someone, um, then they could actually put, for example, a backdoor or a virus into that compiler so that when you compile, when you give it source code written in C, it produces an executable, and you can just, the compiler that you've received or that you've built could just put some kind of virus or some kind of malicious code in there, and you would be none the wiser for a number of reasons, because um, you know, the you know, there's the original bootstrapped compiler is long gone. You've just been working with this chain of compilers made from compilers. There's no way of verifying the actual the content of the executable. And so you can't trust that the program that you've just compiled doesn't have a backdoor in it, because you can't verify that the compiler that you use to build it has an executable in it. And yeah, I think it caused a bit of chaos, if I remember, and probably put more emphasis on the need to have these kind of reproducible builds, especially with regards to compilers. But it's kind of similar to, I think, the couple of years ago, when there was this kind of revelation that, oh, the NPM ecosystem, someone could, in a very low level library, just put in some code to sniff credit card details. And if everyone imports that, there's no good way of verifying it. Um, so, but yeah, appending a backdoor onto main would be quite a straightforward one, I think. Yeah. But I suppose it's just the idea that there's it could be appending a backdoor onto main, or it could be anything really. You just have no way of knowing. It could even be intermittent. It could do it to like 1 in 5 programs, and you would not have no way of verifying it. So it's just the idea that because you can't verify the executable you're running, and like the source code for it because it's just been generated from so many layers of executables. It's yeah, but that would possibly be a good contender for you could have a language that injects into your programs very bad performance. So the debate between statically and dynamically typed languages, yeah, absolutely. Rust is statically linked because there are no dependencies. Worry about the few extra megabytes of binary size. Yeah, that to me, again, this is one of these controversial topics. But that to me wouldn't be a runner uh, as an argument in terms of binary size because I would at least assume like that. Sure, you say the likes of like just on paper, I would say a dynamically typed language would be a bigger. Well, I suppose, yeah, that's the thing. I guess there isn't necessarily a binary with. Well, well, there could be a dynamically typed language that's compiled, but the thing about dynamic versus static is that if you have a dynamically typed language, then the typing information, because dynamically typed languages still generally have types, it's just that they're defined at runtime as opposed to compile time. And therein lies the fact that, say, the likes of Rust can actually perform all its type checking at compile time and then discard all that information because it knows via construction that all this stuff checks out. Whereas for a dynamically typed language, it needs to check that information at runtime. Therefore, it has to have that information at runtime. Therefore, it needs to be included in the binary. Um, and if games were statically linked, yeah. Oh, yeah. Um, oh, sorry, you said statically and dynamically linked. Yes, sorry, big difference. Yeah. Yeah, having them built in. That's a good point. Yeah, I'd be of the similar opinion that we're kind of at the point where, we've such big disks. Do we really have to to use shared stuff still? There are probably situations where that makes sense. Like I personally, well, at least what I know of, say the likes of Mac OS with executables is that they're just kind of transferred in one blob almost, like it has everything within it. Um, and to uninstall it, then you just kind of remove it. It carries all its libraries and things with it. Um, it definitely makes sense coming from an age where disk size really was a concern, and you know you don't necessarily want programs uh, that five different programs that all use the same library have to have it tacked on to the end of the executable. But yeah, I do personally feel that it's less kind of relevant these days, and to be so kind of frugal with disk space. But then I suppose that's kind of coming from a somewhat privileged position of, I have ready access to a lot of good computing power and things like that. And I suppose there's the consideration to be made that a lot of the world still isn't in that position, that maybe there's a lot of areas where disk space still is a concern. So, and I suppose the it's a funny thing as well that um, you know even with all this computing power, there are still domains that do require that kind of micromanagement of space, such as embedded systems and things. But in terms of for end user applications, it's like, yeah, these days we probably can afford to be a bit use static linking a bit more. Uh, yeah, Arch doesn't want me to have multiple libraries. Yeah, yeah, and that's the thing. And even yeah, any packaging system really that tries to be smart with the dependency management, you know, they only think kind of so far ahead, or there is only so far ahead that you can think. It's yeah, I do think static linking could be used to solve so much of that. It's yeah, and even like I've tried it a couple of times as well, just playing around with um like doing the two types, like figuring out how to out like when working with C, figuring out how to use shared libraries. And the thing about static linking versus shared libraries is that, you know, it's an issue kind of from platform to platform as well. So I think if you just statically build stuff, then you have much greater, on Linux at least, you have much more kind of cross-platform potential because, you know, you might have a system that, you know, depends on glibc or muscle and particular versions of those, and whether they're, you know, built with a particular format or not. Like, to be honest, a lot of the stuff is over my head for the most part, but it does seem like an issue that I know it seems like it could be close to being solved if there was kind of agreement on the kind of general purpose use case. But I suppose with the likes of Arch as well, like the emphasis probably is on keeping things as lean and um, kind of lightweight as possible. So I suppose it comes down to individual and community preference as well to a certain extent. But I'm definitely at a point where I just want things to be easy and work with minimal effort from me. So and yet here I am using Rust. So yeah, do my actions match my words? I'm not sure, but I enjoy Rust at least. So um, so looking for match locks, and there's another one. And I've actually forgot to put some braces around those. And same here. And location as well. Yeah. And let's try compiling that. Oh, no, something's gone wrong. So let's see, 797. 713. Okay, so it's back quite a ways. So what I'll probably do is undo my changes back to there. And let's see, can I, oh, was it just, I probably just missed missed the closing delimiter. That should, oh no, I added it back in there at one point. So what's the issue there? Let's try just applying these again. Flatpak and yeah, and I think there's the likes of zero install and things like that. But again, I suppose it's all stuff that kind of potentially leads to a fragmented ecosystem. I think like there probably are a lot of solutions to these, but probably is just a matter of getting consensus on them. Like I will admit that I probably use Docker to actually work around a lot of those issues. In that I try to like my main machine, the one that I'm using here, actually isn't doesn't actually have anything really installed on it, bar Docker, Git, Vim, and or Neo. No, I don't even have Neo Vim, and a couple of other packages, and then everything else I just kind of install it under Docker, so that if there are any issues with versioning or libraries or anything like that, I can just clear it all and start from scratch. I think some people use the likes of Nix and NixOS for kind of similar purposes, but it's yeah, I think it'll be a while before there's kind of a fairly kind of standardized approach to that in the Linux ecosystem. Yeah, I've actually not used Nix. It seems um, like an idea, like the idea of it sounds very cool to me, but it also sounds like more effort than I'm willing to put in these days. Again, I'm nearly more at the point where it's just like try and install it under Docker. If it doesn't work, I'm not. I'm probably not going to spend too much time on it. So yeah, getting a bit old and grumpy for all those things. So 698. So running into some issues here. Missing an ending delimiter. Oh, so it was actually with this one. Was it? And something with 713. So this is probably another issue with dereferencing. Firecracker, I haven't heard of Firecracker actually. Micro VMs written in Rust. No, I haven't heard of that. I must take a look. I'll actually copy paste that link for later. Thanks very much. It sounds interesting. Is it somewhat similar to, so you say micro VMs? Is it any relation to kind of unikernels? I know they were kind of a big thing. Actually, I think someone mentioned OCaml a while back as well. I think unikernels were being researched in OCaml for a while and seem to have a lot of potential, but I haven't really heard much of them lately. I think container technology in general kind of won out, but the idea at least seemed quite interesting. So 796. Okay, so I seem to be losing a variable somewhere. Because so there's an actual variable in there that I'm using later on. So what would be my best bet here? That's an interesting one. I'll actually leave that one for later potentially, because it might be something I need to take a further look on, because something that I've noticed in this language or in this implementation of the language so far is that there are a couple of areas that have the potential to deadlock because of the way I'm handling the mutex kind of extraction. So there are definitely a couple of places that I need to refactor to remove that deadlock, and that could be one of them in future. So I'll do the same there. I assume source is being used. Oh, maybe not in that case. Let's try this. Well, I'll need to correct the syntax here. New circ didn't rename the variable when you were doing refactors for those last couple of lines. Oh, thanks for the catch. I must. I'll go back through those. Let's just double check all of those. So let's see. So that one I skipped. That one's location. That one's location. That one's expression. I think we're all right. Thanks for highlighting that though. What I'll do at the end of it, like, because that is a very good point. When I'm doing a git commit for these changes, I'll do a double check just to make sure. Because like I said, not quite unit testing things at the moment, so there is potential for those kind of issues to creep in. So thanks for highlighting that. I'll have to double check that when I'm committing. Oh, thanks for checking the YouTube as well. The YouTube is a good bit behind, unfortunately. I am trying to catch up, and maybe over the Christmas break I'll be able to upload a couple more. But yeah, thanks for your interest and for chatting in. So where's the next piece to look at? So if I grab that. And do that as well. Let's try that. Oops. I forgot to close that one and that one. Whew, I wonder how many I've left. I'm probably halfway through the file at this point. But I think these in general are probably concentrated in a certain section. So here's a place where there probably is an opportunity to fix it either. I wonder. Yeah, no, that should be all right. XPR. I should probably do like a vim macro to kind of capture the to insert the vim macro to insert the Rust macro at some point, but no, it should be all right. So those ones. So I think that's more or less it for the low-hanging fruit, at least, or the obvious changes. 992, did we get rid of the need for oh yeah, so that isn't needed anymore. Nice. So I'll see if I can change that. So so that's, and in terms of style, I think that's maybe what I'll do is just add in some extra spacing there. Does that still compile? Yeah. So add that in, and now I'll Thanks to Usurp's suggestion, I'll just double check the names that I'm using. So that's cond location. Um, oh, actually, that's one thing that I want to check as well. That oh well, I didn't actually need to change the syntax in these because they're not all blocks anymore. So that's all right. So I just need to pay attention to the names. That doesn't need to be in a block anymore. So can only assign. That was probably done before I added support for expressions. So if I try that again, yeah. So that's expr name, item name, start and end, location, 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 expression, start, end, end, start, end, yeah. Expression, name, expression. Yeah, so I think they're good. If there are any crazy bugs in the compiler, next time when I'm doing stuff, I'll know where to look at least. So I'll commit that. So what was the name of the macro? Add match. But that's not very descriptive. Let's see. Whoops. Followed by match. Yeah, there we go. Or yeah, that's probably sufficient. Cool. So one last thing that I wanted to do then before I finished up was use that new. Where is null being used? And why is it written like that? Surely I could. Ah, yes. So this isn't your standard. If true, return true. Otherwise, return false. So this is actually using pattern matching. So it's not, unfortunately, not a matter of simply return that equals v. I don't think. I assume that's impossible. Or because assignment isn't an expression. Yeah, so that can stay there for another day. So I'll take a look at an eval expression to int. And there are a couple of functions in this family, I would say. So where is that being used in my crib sheet? So so the idea here is, so we'll try it with a bool first actually. Eval expression to bool. And so one thing that I'm doing here, so all this does is there's again a common pattern where I evaluate an expression and I match it so that I can get one specific type out. So this will often be in the case of getting an integer, say as an array index, or a boolean for a condition. And one thing I'm doing in here is, it's not something that I necessarily do as a practice, but I take a description of, or a name for what the thing is. So if, in this case, it's a condition, and so I pass that in as information so that I can have this error message in the case of an error. So let's see. In fact, I'll comment this out for the moment. And in the case of an error, I can do this. Now, this does go against my personal beliefs in terms of best practices around error handling, because what I'm doing here is I'm passing in the name of the thing so that it can be added to a description of the error message. Generally, what I would say in this case is that, this is information that this function doesn't really need to know or care about. It's really metadata being provided by the caller to decorate the error, which in general, that should be performed, that kind of operation should be done by the caller in the likes of a, context addition, and the contextual information such as, name should be added there. Having said all that, this is, I suppose, the whole reason for creating this function is to just kind of abstract this common pattern. So I'm going to look past that rule for now, but wouldn't be one of my kind of best practices. Try to use file existence as a global variable. Yeah. An atomic bool. Okay, interesting. Like surrounded in an atomic reference count, is it? Yeah, Rust really doesn't like. Yeah, I couldn't find out how to even create a global variable that wasn't constant. I was considering that in one of my projects just to get it past a certain point, but yeah, that's certainly a kind of a creative workaround. Um, yeah, that's the thing actually. I suppose following on from our discussion about defining things in main, does seem like if you do want something global that everything has access to, you probably are going to have to define it in main and have some kind of um, route back to main in from the function calls or objects. So we'll do that. That's an okay. Name must be an integer. Well, in this case, it must be a Boolean. And what's going wrong here? I need a comma there, I think. And that's not used yet, but that is about to be resolved, I hope. So scopes, built-ins, cond, and condition. I can probably put that on one line then. And that was a result, so I'll put a question mark after it. Cool, so that works. What else am I looking for? So I'm looking for variant or uses of match eval expression. So same thing here. That's probably too much stuff to put on a single line, even though it's not really adding much. Probably break them up a little bit just because there's a bit much happening on each of those lines. So this must be an integer. So what I'll do is I'll actually extract that. Actually, that needs to be refactored. So what I'll do is I'll copy the Boolean version and just rename it. Now, here I'm using different yeah, maybe I'll do it like that. So we'll go let n is equal to val expression to I64, and I'll call that index. And in this case, this is an interesting one. I wonder, will I be able to refactor that? Oh yeah, I should, because x's is still within the guard. Let's try that. Static thing atomic bool is equal to atomic bool. Oh, okay, yeah, it's its own type. Yeah, it's funny how yeah, so many of these things seem like they would work in theory in Rust, and then kind of I suppose kind of fail for, like, or things that seem like they'd work in Rust and then fail for reasons that aren't exactly what, for example, I would expect anyway, but eventually just comes down to this isn't allowed in Rust. So nearly no matter how you attempt it, you're probably going to be out of luck. I think for me, one of the big ones a few streams ago was trying to define a recursive data type, I think, which isn't allowed because you could potentially end up with circular references, I believe. It can still be achieved, I believe, with mutable references, or not mutable references, but arc mutexes. But again, that's because you're kind of working around the rules of the language at that point. And as expression can only be used to convert between primitive types, so that's probably because didn't have a question mark there and it was being interpreted as a result. Cool, so that seems to be working. What's the next one? So that's an integer as well. So it's being although no, it's actually, that should be key must be a string. And I'll create that. Maybe I'll order them in terms of how they're defined in the value type or the value enum. And this will be, well, is string defined? I define it as stir. the kind of the representation of string in this language. Yeah. Um, so this will then need to be raw string val expression to string, yank all that. That'll be key. I don't need my question mark there so that I don't make the same mistake as last time. I can pull out all of this and then get rid of that, and we remove a level of indentation there as well, which is really nice. Probably, yeah, actually removed 2 because of the new block that was being created in the match. So that's really nice. Now here is a tricky one because I can't just copy strings out of the likes of those sections. Yeah, so maybe I'll leave that one for now, even though that would have been a nice one too. Because don't necessarily want to be copying strings around the place, even though I wonder, could I return a reference to it? If it was no, I'll take a look at that kind of an approach later on maybe, but for the moment, yeah, I think for the moment I won't. Yeah, it must be a string. I've got an integer here again, so I can replace that. And I can correct another typo here. And get rid of another 2 levels of indentation. Yep. Probably the same there. In fact, I can probably copy this same code from above. It is an index. This is a string, I would say, so that's probably, yeah, not a runner. Oops, a lot of errors there. So 739 will start there. What's going on? Because I'm already dereferencing that for them. So I'm returning I'm dereferencing it inside the guard, which creates a copy, which means that it doesn't need to be dereferenced after the fact. So that's all good. Yeah, this will probably remove a chunk of indentation, which will be very nice as well. fact, I'll just copy one of these lines. Oh no, that. Oh no, that one I can't, but the likes of this I can. So that would be end, that would be an index. There we go. And same thing here, but with start. Oh, in this case though, I do need to replace that as well. So I can get rid of those two, and get rid of those two, unindent that, get rid of those, unindent that, and again. So same thing here, remove dereferences, 816, and another dereference. So that's a chunk of these done now. That would be end and index as well, so that can be removed. So more or less the same here, I think. So yeah, this probably isn't one of the more interesting parts of the stream. It's more my kind of stubborn attempt to document the whole journey of this language, but it is probably going to be, in terms of probably not going to be the most exhilarating in terms of content, but it'll hopefully be a nice document. Oh. I'll have to do the same after these changes as well, just to make sure that I haven't gone too far with the renaming, just to make sure that all the names have been kept correct. So that's a string, that won't be changed. That's a string. I have an object there. It would be nice to do something to handle those as well, but I'm not sure what can be done. So list string, object, string, string. Actually, some of those are cloning the strings, so it would probably be all right to convert those. Yeah, so what I'll do now is I'll compile that. Again, yeah, a couple of dereferences that need to be resolved. So let's get rid of that. 837. 3 of those, and are there a couple up here as well? No, they're all good. So what I'll do is commit those changes. Can that be put onto one line? No, that's quite long. But let's see. So I already broke my own rule in that I was going to check all of these. So that's cond and condition. Yeah. That's location and index. Yeah. I was just correcting a typo. Start range end, end range end, and that got corrected to start range, start and end range end. Let's see up here, location and index. Yeah. And is there another one inside? No, I think that's all right. Start index and end index. Yeah, index and start and end. And let's see, end and index there as well. Yeah. Oh, that was it. That was actually very. Oh, I should follow the advice and turn on that spam filter soon. Actually. So let's see. I'll commit that, and that was. Let's see. Abstract what? Cool. And then last one, so will be just string. So I'll just push that as well. Yeah, so just anyone, excuse me, to anyone checking out the repo for this as well. I suppose first of all, good luck, because it's probably not the clean. It's been getting cleaner, but it's probably not in the most readable setup at the moment. But the branch I'm currently working on, I think the default that's being shown on GitHub is WIP dev, and that's kind of, I suppose there's a storied history behind that, and I'll be refactoring the branch layout and repository structure in time. But basically, what I'm currently working on is this work in progress Laurel branch. So for anyone interested in checking out the source code that I'm currently working on, that's where you'll find it. So yeah, and so let's see. So we have strings. So if there are times where where I'm getting a string but I'm cloning it, yeah, then I can do it like this. So in this case, what I'll do is val expression to string. I should probably call it str, because that's, I suppose, more in line with the other function names. There we go. Next one. Similar thing here. So that's not a clone one. Now the thing is, I probably will I probably will. What am I trying to say here? Probably will have to refactor this to not be a clone so often for efficiency, but that's something to check out later. Okay, and I think that's more or less it for the strings, or at least the clonable strings, which was still there were still a few, I think three of them in total. Yeah, so let's take a look at that. Again, just kind of whittling some lines down at this point. Yeah, so like, it's not insignificant the amount of lines I'm removing. Like I probably removed 12 lines here. So if I get name property key, and then I suppose I add probably an equivalent number, but that's okay. Okay, so I ended up with total um, uh, two more lines, but at the same time, I feel like the abstraction is slightly clearer, and you know, it's resulted in some kind of shorter functions, so that's kind of good. Um, anyway, that's more or less it for the changes I had planned today. Thanks very much for the discussions and articulation on available user 5, and I think where is it also Atlas Ints for tuning in and chatting. Yeah, really nice to talk about this stuff. And yeah, I'll be leaving it there. Hope you check out the stream tomorrow for my more kind of regular segment where I'll be working on more language features. But until then, thanks very much for checking this out and take care. Bye bye.